This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me. Each day's news seems to reinforce the cliché that truth is stranger than fiction. But the strangest thing of all is that so much of our current politics is quite literally based on fiction. And that isn't an exaggeration. The right-wing oligarch Peter Thiel has named his global surveillance company Palantir after the crystal balls featured in The Lord of the Rings. And he's also repeatedly told friends and people he's advising to look to mid-20th century science fiction novels for business ideas. Never mind that so many of those novels were dystopias. In a similar vein, Elon Musk, Thiel's fellow reactionary oligarch, named his AI chatbot Grok after a term used in a novel written by the authoritarian capitalist Robert A. Heinlein. But there are other Republican figures who constantly reference fiction in their politics as well, including the fascist writer Curtis Yarvin, Vice President JD Vance, and podcaster Steve Bannon. Each of these figures routinely reference Lord of the Rings or the racist novel Camp of the Saints. And who can forget Ayn Rand, the terrible novelist who called herself a philosopher? Why is it that so many of today's far-right political figures are taking their cues from fiction? Well, there are a lot of reasons for it, but probably the biggest is that some of the most influential writers like Heinlein or editors like John W. Campbell actually wanted people to do just that. There's a lot to talk about here in all of this, and joining me to discuss is Jeet Heer. He is a columnist at The Nation, where he writes about politics and social issues, but he also tackles culture and how it relates to politics as well in his writing and on his podcast, The Time of Monsters. I hope you'll enjoy. Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, culture, media, and technology, and how they all intersect. And if you are a paid subscribing member, you have unlimited access to the archives, and I thank you very much for your support. And if you're watching on YouTube, please do click the like and subscribe button so you can get notified whenever there's a new episode. All right, let's get into the program. And joining me now is Jeet Heer. Hey, Jeet, welcome to Theory of Change.
Oh, it's great to be on.
Yes, it's going to be a fun discussion today, I think. And we have the perfect news hook, which is that Elon Musk recently announced that he's basically abandoning his Mars focus with SpaceX to be focusing on a moon base, which actually coincides with what he has said is one of his favorite novels of all time, and one that you yourself have written about as well. So maybe let's kind of start with there, if we could, please.
Yeah, I think the novel he was alluding to is Robert Heinlein's Moon is a Harsh Mistress, which is from the late 60s, I think 1966. Very well-regarded science fiction novel. Arguably, I think one of Heinlein's best, maybe his last great work, because he went into a long period of decline after that. It's set in a future lunar colony that is exploited by Earth, and there's a libertarian revolution modeled largely on the American Revolution, although interestingly there are elements of the Russian Revolution that are also alluded to. And the lunar colonists, with the help of an AI, achieve liberation, and then their goal is an anarchist future, like a moon where there is no government. Yeah. And in the novel, he has this slogan, Tanstaffel, there is no such thing as a free lunch, which he got from his fellow science fiction writer, Jerry Pournelle, which became then a major slogan of the Libertarian Party. Milton Friedman's son, David, used to walk around with a Tanstaffel medallion, kind of like a pimp outfit. So this is like so the novel has been very influential, and I think one of the things in Heinlein's work, both in that work and other works like The Man Who Sold the Moon, is the idea of space as a new frontier for capitalism. This is a place where um, uh, 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 business can finally be unshackled from the regulatory state and achieve a free market utopia, which always seemed like very ironic and unlikely because all the sort of space exploration of the 20th century was done through massive state intervention. First with the Soviet state, and then as along with the NASA and the American state. But now it looks like in our new 21st century, Elon Musk and others are reviving this idea that space will be a new frontier where capitalism can finally be liberated from all earthly laws and regulations.
Yeah, exactly. And Heinlein is so for people who are really into kind of the tropes of fiction, that he kind of was the originator in many ways of the libertarians in space trope, if you will.
Yeah, no, and we should say, just in case not everyone's aware, but he is like one of the major American science fiction writers. I think among science fiction fans, there used to be the idea of the big three or the big four. So it's like Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Ray Bradbury, and Robert Heinlein. Like these were the major figures of Anglophone science fiction, and it's hard to overstate his impact. I think what Ernest Hemingway might have been to mainstream American literature, Robert Heinlein was to science fiction. He was just a major figure for for the mid 20th century, for 4 or 5 decades, and cast a huge shadow over the
extremely
genre.
prolific.
Hugely prolific, often winning the top prizes in the genre, and also spawning endless number of imitators. So the libertarian in space, but also military science fiction comes out of Heinlein. A lot of the younger,
well, I mean, we should say, Starship Troopers was his novel.
He wrote Starship Trooper, and so I mean, we will talk more about him as we progress. Just as a sort of signifier, one should think of him as one of the major figures in this genre.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and one of the other things about him that he has in common with some of the other people we'll be talking about is that, especially. Starting with Moon is a Harsh Mistress and later novels, that, a lot of what I guess you could say maybe even earlier, but, a lot of his novels are characterized by having a character that's basically a stand-in for himself. And this character goes on for pages at a time. And it's basically that it became kind of a thing for right-wing, what I call authoritarian capitalists, so post-libertarians, whatever you want to call them, that they abandoned the idea of philosophy and they turned to fiction instead to make the exposition of their ideas.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think one way to think about this, though, is that science fiction has always been a literature of ideas, and obviously the sort of novel of ideas is something that has deep roots. One can think of Voltaire, Candide, many other sort of classical works, and even going back to the Middle Ages, sort of religious works, the sort of mystery plays. There is a kind of literature that explores concepts and which has characters that are sort of figureheads for different positions. Now, what happens?
Pilgrim's Progress. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Pilgrim's Progress, Gulliver's Travel.
Ben-Hur, yeah.
Yeah. But what happens in the 19th century is that with the sort of rise of the bourgeois novel, the realistic novel of family life, business, the classic novels of Jane Austen, Dickens, Tolstoy, that becomes a kind of dominant literary form. And then the novel of ideas really heads off into genre. It becomes more associated with fiction that is imaginative and what we now call science fiction, although that term is really popularized in the 1920s. But I'm thinking of people like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, and she herself was the daughter of two great
Mary
philosophers.
Wollstonecraft. Yeah,
Yeah,
absolutely.
Wollstonecraft and Goodwin. Their father was a
Yeah.
philosophical liberal who wrote novels of ideas. And Frankenstein is this idea of using scientific extrapolation to investigate ideas, and that tradition was carried through by people like Jules Verne and H.G. Wells.
For sure.
And the interesting thing is, it's overwhelmingly a tradition of liberalism and the left and the socialism. It is
Yeah.
a tradition of people who are coming out of the Enlightenment, who believe that history is change, that humans can actually take control of history and make history, as against earlier ideas that reality is fated, reality is providential and destined. And then these novels of ideas are explorations. Well, what happens when we try to take control of history? What are the consequences, good or bad? Obviously, in Frankenstein, it is this is showing how the Enlightenment could go bad. It could actually lead to creations of monsters. One sees that as well in H.G. Wells' Invisible Man.
Yeah.
But combined with that, there's also tradition ideas of well, what are ways in which we can
Yeah.
take control of
Or,
reality to make it better, like utopian fiction,
yeah.
which
Edward
Wells wrote.
Bellamy.
Yeah,
Yeah.
Edward Bellamy, but also H.G. Wells's Shape of Things to Come. There's
Exactly.
a long tradition of this. And so, I mean, what's interesting is that at some, I mean, this maybe is the degree to which libertarianism does come out of classical liberal, what they call classical liberalism, but which is this broadly this Enlightenment project of amelioration and control of destiny. That Heinlein, I think, is very interesting. That he is a transitional figure. He came out of the sort of in the 30s and 40s. He was a socialist, very much in the tradition of H.G. Wells. Later moved to the right, and there's a whole strain of sort of libertarian science fiction that comes out of that. And one can see that if one is interested in ideas, that this is the type of literature and when one is interested in politics, this is the type of literature that would be appealing. Murray Rothbard, a major figure of the Austrian economics and very much an authoritarian libertarian.
For sure.
He has this in his autobiography. He talks about how his mother loved Dostoevsky and Tolstoy, and he could never understand why she loved them. And then in the 1950s, he read Ayn Rand's The Fountainhead and Atlas Shrugged, and he realized, wait a minute, this is powerful. This is what literature can do. And so this is the literature that is appealing for people who are sort of politically engaged, politically active. And, aside from Heinlein, there's a whole tradition of sort of increasingly, very right-wing science fiction. People like Jerry Pournelle, Larry Nivens. And in some ways, one could cynically say, and this is very true of Heinlein, that one of the appeals is that in some ways this literature is a way of dreaming the future of, and also as in dreams, working out tensions that you can't work out in life. So in Heinlein, one often sees, I think in Starship Troopers, one sees war without PTSD, because they're just killing these bugs. So there's no moral cost to war. In his sort of sexual fantasies like Stranger in a Strange Land, one sees the utopian dream of total sexual liberation without any of the sort of ethical consequences of sex. And in A Moon is the Harsh Mistress, is imagining a sort of utopian libertarian world on the moon without the sort of ecological and class tensions that emerge in every real existing historical capitalist society.
Yeah, absolutely. And it is it's related, I think, so yeah, you have the emergence of the novel of ideas, but it became more important for authoritarian capitalism because because these ideas are not very coherent, frankly. And they don't, so they can't really work as philosophy, because if you're writing a book of philosophy and you put it out there and you have a big giant volume and you've structured your argument and you've exposed what your true objectives are and where you want, if they were to do that, people would be horrified at what they want, right?
Yeah.
And Friedrich Nietzsche is kind of the example for that. But and I'll come back to him in a second. But so essentially, we saw this also with regard to economics as well. With this. With this idea of Herbert von Mises of praxeology, that I don't have to prove my arguments using data or historical instances. I just have to appeal to common sense, because I can invent a scenario, and that was literally what this guy largely did in his work. Is that he would invent scenarios and be like, okay, so we know this will happen because it's obvious that this is what they would do. And like that's his work. And then so of course this is a movement of that nature would tend toward fiction, I would think.
Absolutely. The science fiction writer Samuel Delany, who's very different politics than Heinlein, but admires Heinlein, but did say that one thing Heinlein was doing was trying to come up with scenarios that would justify his right-wing politics. That is to say, in what circumstances would it be justified to deny democracy to everyone except people who work in the military, and also to carry on a war of extermination? Well, if you do have these humanities has an existential threat of these space aliens who are bugs, who have no consciousness, no morality, and then the kind of war of extermination carried out by authoritarian military regime might be what is necessary, right? So he's constantly trying to come up with scenarios whereby what he is politically desires makes sense.
Absolutely, and that certainly is the case with regard to Ayn Rand as well. So she called herself a philosopher, actually, but no one that I know of who has any sort of respectability or within or regard in philosophy regarded her as a philosopher, because she wasn't doing philosophy. She was just writing novels and op-eds. That was her output. She was not doing any kind of systematizing or and that's significant, because it does, when you look to the politics of these people, their descendants like Elon Musk and other people like them, they hate debate. They don't like it. They don't like to be questioned. They don't like it when you say that their ideas are dumb and here's 20 reasons why. They get angry at you, and or even if you want to track their jet, like the Elon jet guy, he's gonna ban you for doing that. They can't do this. Philosophy is based on argument. You get two philosophers in the room, you get 5 opinions, and so they can't handle it, I think.
I should say, with a novel of ideas, though, there are sort of variations on it. I do think the greater novels of ideas are the ones where there is some sort of actual philosophical debate, where you have contestants that are both kind of making semi plausible or treated with some degree of respect, and then you have to or there's some sort of difficult to resolve.
There's ambiguity,
Ambiguity, I would say, someone like Dostoevsky, even though he has a very clear, reactionary point of view, he is doing sort of novels of ideas where different positions are contested. And the sort of term that the literary critics use, coming out of Bakhtin, is polyphonic, that these novels are presenting a range of different voices, and they're being contested in the work of fiction. And I think one of the interesting things about Heinlein kind of illustrates this is, I actually do feel like his earlier work, which I regard as his superior work of the 40s and 50s, is polyphonic. There is a range of different voices, but that he's increasingly, there's a kind of authoritarian turn in his fiction where it does really become a kind of hectoring voice, where you basically have these characters that are like Lazarus Long, who are stand-ins for Heinlein, who voice his opinion, and if there are other characters, they just stand around and either they exist sort of Socratic.
Yep. You're right. You're right.
You're right.
You're absolutely right.
Exactly. no, exactly. And yeah, I mean, I think one should acknowledge that it's not just the problem is not just that they're using fiction, but like that it's
Yeah,
a lot
yeah.
of it is what I consider like a bad fiction of ideas, one in which there's not contested stakes or a polyphonic range of voices.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. That is a fair point, and I'm glad you said that. Well, and in that regard, though, one of the other kind of problems that a lot of this fiction has is that the authors, who are pretty much all men except for Ayn Rand, they don't know how to write women, and
Yeah,
they don't
yeah.
know how to write about them, or how to, or how their characters are authentic in of themselves. So like every character in Heinlein who's a woman, she's she's got big boobs, and she's incredibly sexual, and everyone loves her, and she's super competent, and witty, and and it's just like, after a while you would think he would have thought, okay, maybe this is a little annoying to have the same character all the time.
Yeah,
But yeah,
no,
or just like
no.
flighty and dumb, and like, so just cliched female characters.
Yeah, no. I think that's a sort of like a fair criticism. I think one way there's a critic, Farah Mendelssohn, and a few other people have sort of said this. That I think one thing with Heinlein was interesting, that he wanted to imagine a world of sort of sexual equality. Like, because part of his sort of progressivism in the 30s and 40s when he came out of Wells was a belief in free love, and also female equality. So his women characters were like like engineers. They had some, but then they would also always want, like, let's have lots of babies once we get married. But the problem he had was he was trying to imagine a world of like gender equality, but he had no basis for like imagining that world would be qualitatively different, and that women would have other demands that would make changes. So what he's basically ended up imagining was a world where the two genders are basically the same, that the women have like all the sort of like sexual desires of the men, and also that there's no conflict. Everyone is happy in this free love utopia, and there's no heartbreak. There's no love triangle. There's no falling in and out of love. I mean, there's a real kind of like a problem with the sort of like emotional range or imagination or level of empathy in the work.
Yeah, absolutely, and we'll come back to that as we circle back to him as kind of the synecdoche of sci-fi, right wing sci-fi. But like, just to circle back to the philosophy kind of thing, like, to me, I think that in so many ways, Friedrich Nietzsche is the apotheosis of all reactionary thought. Like, it never got better after him. Everything was a decline after him, and which is ironic. Or
Yeah.
maybe he would say that was inevitable, perhaps. And his writings are just very acerbic. But one of the things that he says in multiple different ways in different books is that things that are true, they don't have to be proven through argument. And that basically having to make an argument is for cucks, essentially.
Yeah.
And that's kind of another thing that you do kind of see within this authoritarian capitalist milieu that comes after him. They all kind of have that opinion, even if they've never read Nietzsche, which is interesting, I think.
Yeah. No, I do think that this the kind of the way I would describe it in not just Heinlein, but this sort of like broader tradition, is there's a kind of imperial self. There's the idea that the self has an authenticity and authority, and can be a final word. And so it does tend to lead to the writing of fiction that is simply a bunch of op-eds, which you simply have a bunch of characters that are opinionating, and there's no necessity for kind of like a broader engagement with other voices or with a conflict.
Yeah, absolutely. And of course, so there's a natural inclination to this, but it also, within the realm of right-wing fiction, It was cultivated also, in particular by a guy named John W. Campbell, who
Mm-hmm.
was a very long-serving editor of the magazine, which actually still exists now, Analog Science Fiction. But at the time, it was called Astounding. Was the main word for it when mostly when Heinlein was writing for it. But so Campbell himself was extremely right wing, and actually probably more. I mean, more so than Heinlein.
Yeah.
A lot
No,
of it.
no.
I mean, he supported segregation.
Yeah, no,
Can you
absolutely.
talk about it?
Yeah,
If you,
yeah, no.
for,
So Campbell, like so science fiction, as I mentioned, there's this older European tradition of Verne and Wells, but within America, it really like emerged in the 1920s and the 30s in the realm of pulp fiction, of these like very cheap magazines where the writers were paid like like a penny a word, um, and was at a very kind of crude literary level. A lot of it was like sort of just like maybe the ancestor of things like Star Wars now, just like slam bam.
or King
Uh,
Kong, yeah.
huh? Huh?
King Kong.
Yeah, King Kong. Yeah,
Is an
exactly. Yeah,
example
it's
of
just
what
like
we're talking about here.
yeah. It's just sort of like action adventure with not a lot of scientific rigor or philosophical content. Really sort of like cheap genre fiction. Edgar Rice Burroughs is John Carter of Mars would be like a prominent example of this. Now Campbell, who had like a little bit of a scientific education, he was a dropout at MIT, had some engineering background, took over Astounding in the late like 1930s, and he tried to was very successful in kind of like elevating science fiction by like insisting on a greater level of scientific rigor. Like he basically said he wanted the fiction in Astounding to be like an issue of the Saturday Evening Post, but if it was like written like 100 years in the future, and what became known as hard science fiction. So a lot of emphasis on things like engineering and more rigorous extrapolation. He recruited a whole bunch of very influential writers, Isaac Asimov, Arthur C. Clarke, Theodore Sturgeon. But one aspect of Campbell himself was that this element of extrapolation and rigor was one side of his personality, but he's also like very divided amongst himself, and he had a kind of like lifelong attraction towards pseudoscience. And famously, like one of his writers was L. Ron Hubbard, who's also a friend of Heinlein. And the L. Ron Hubbard was a pulp science fiction writer, but then came up with this sort of crackpot form of psychoanalysis called Dianetics. And the very first place Dianetics was ever shown in the world was in the pages of Astounding Science Fiction. It was published as an article in Astounding Science Fiction, and it became
and Campbell loved it. Yeah,
Campbell loved it, and Campbell said had a problem, sort of like nasal congestion, and he credited Dianetics with curing his nasal congestion. And there were a lot of science fiction writers in that circle. Dianetics began as a movement within science fiction, and a lot of writers in the Astounding world, such as A.E. Van Vogt, Kathleen McLean, many others, became early Scientologists. I mean, later, I think Heinlein's book "Stranger in a Strange Land" is kind of like working out of like what happens when a science fiction writer creates a religion. Ironically, itself leading to the creation of more religions. But I think. After the Dianetics episode, Campbell like increasingly was attracted to sort of like crackpot ideas. So within the pages of Astounding, a science fiction magazine, but they also published like nonfiction articles. He would publish articles touting perpetual motion machine that someone had discovered, the Dean drive. Would have articles on telekinesis and ESP, and would have
food supplements too. Actually,
yeah, food supplements.
Yeah.
He very strongly believed when the findings. He was a smoker, and when the ideas that came along, when the discoveries came along that smoking causes cancer, he would publish articles like saying like why they're wrong. And one way to think about him is I think he was actually a precursor to a type of person that is now quite familiar, which
Oh
is
yeah.
the sort of like the contrarian crank, right? Like whatever mainstream science says, and he would use the same argument that we now hear, like well, we can't accept the scientific consensus because Galileo came along and he rejected the scientific consensus, and the consensus was wrong, right? So he used that kind of logic to like constantly like go one after the other for these contrarian ideas, and like as well into the realm of sort of politics, like the defending not just segregation. He would publish editorials like why slavery was actually like a good thing. And this is like well beyond Heinlein.
Oh, and
But
also rejecting black characters as mean well.
Famously, and Samuel Delaney, who's an African American science fiction writer, sent him, or this agent sent him Nova, a science fiction novel with a black character. And Campbell told the agent, this is a great book. I would love to publish it, but I can't imagine, in the future you would have African astronaut. And so, no. And I mean, within the fiction itself, like we're talking about his nonfiction ideas, but within the fiction itself, in sort of Campbellian science fiction, there's a very strong emphasis on eugenics. Like this was a major concern in Astounding. Many of the writers dealt with the idea of like, can we actually create a Superman, an Ubermensch that will go beyond and have the kind of telekinetic powers?
Nietzsche.
And I mean, the sort of culmination of this, although one that maybe shows the way some of his writers outgrew his own politics, is Frank Herbert's Dune, which was first published in Astounding, which is taking like all the ideas in Dune are from the Astounding tradition. So it is this, far future world, galactic empire, genetic engineering to create a Ubermensch, Superman. But if one reads, like, I think Herbert, like, I think it is, even in the first Dune novel, and certainly in the subsequent Dune novels, which were published in Astounding, tellingly enough, it is very clear that this is meant to be a bad thing. Like, it is meant to show that, like, if you create this kind of like, superior being, he will like disrupt the universe in very horrible ways and lead to like catastrophe. I mean, this goes back to the idea of novel ideas. I think if a novel of ideas like works out the contradictions of an issue, there's some value there. But certainly, I think Campbellian science fiction, increasingly was very right wing, and so much so that Campbell lost his best writers. I think it's not an accident that in the last decade of Astounding, of his editorship, he died in the early 70s. Like people like Isaac Asimov.
Or he went and started his own magazine.
Yeah, he started his own magazine. But people like like people who had been coming out of Campbell science fiction weren't writing for him because Campbell clearly wanted a specific type of fiction, which is like adventure fiction where human characters defeat aliens. Because this is like he said, like, you can't have a novel story where aliens defeat humans because that's just not possible. Humanity has to be the greatest species in the universe. And I'm sorry, like, if you're dealing with a fiction of ideas, and there are people who have written, like Thomas Desch and others, have written novels where aliens defeat humans, because that should be a possibility. Like, it is possible that we are not the summit of creation, right? Like,
especially if they can come here. Like, we're not the smart ones in that scenario.
No. But I mean, within Campbell's, like, his editorial mandate was humanity always has to win, and there always has to be a solution to problems. And so it is. But as I said, I think, like, in terms of, we're talking about the politics, I think that he was a sort of precursor of this kind of, like, now much more prominent, like, do your own science, distrust, like, you can't trust the establishments like science, and a real sort of attraction towards crackpot ideas. And some of that you see in, like, Heinlein. I think, like, if one wants to give him any sort of credit at all, he's a little bit more modest than that. And he would actually, he had arguments with Campbell, particularly on, like, racism, where, like, the Heinlein, like, had very dodgy racial stuff, but like he did actually try to he was aware of the problem with racism, and he did try to, like, imagine a sort of multiracial future.
Yeah. Well, and yeah, with regard to this mentality, though, of crack pottery, and the political valence of the fiction, I think that in some ways one could argue that. So when you look at science as a profession, there's basically, very broadly speaking, there's two types of scientists. That you could say that an engineer is a scientist,
Yeah.
and often they are said to be. But then there's also the research
Hmm.
scientists, and the research scientists, they have to be collaborative. They have to exist within a community and bounce ideas off of each other and correct each other and accept correction, and be open to new ideas, and work as teams, because especially as science became more and more complex, as obviously the Manhattan Project is kind of the first real illustration of that. That this is not a thing that could have been done by one person,
Hmm.
and all major scientific projects, that is now the case. There is not any scientific major discovery now that is done by one person. Doesn't
Hmm.
happen. And so they have a communitarian tradition and ethos, and that is why research science, when you look at polls, they do tend to be overwhelmingly more liberal,
Hmm.
or democratic in the U.S. And whereas engineers, they they operate from what they think are first principles. In other words, things that are true, then they extrapolate from them, and that inherently, I think one could argue, it engenders an epistemic standpoint where I'm just applying what's true,
Hmm.
and
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
and and you don't have to discover what is true, or how do you even know what is truth, or how
Yeah.
could you arrive at truth. They don't have to answer those questions, because they're not those questions are already settled for what they do as a profession. And Heinlein was an engineer.
No, he's very much an engineer, and I think I mean like I think what you say is true. I'd also ask maybe emphasize the sort of educational aspect of engineering, but I think there is a sort of training in sort of like binary thinking of true false rather than sort of a hermeneutics of cumulative knowledge that is sort of peer reviewed and tested within the realm of science fiction. I do think like a lot of the science in the sort of Campbellian tradition is old fashioned, like in the sense that
Yeah.
they're always imagining the lone inventor. What the literary critic John Clute calls the Edisonade. Edisonian fiction, like you're imagining a Thomas Edison figure
Exactly.
who's like working in his garage and comes up with something. That is what is considered in Campbellian science fiction to be science, and that has actually not been, like actual
Not been
science.
true. Yeah. No, and
Where,
we see
hey,
that with fiction of Arthur C. Clarke, for instance. Like
yeah,
his fiction, transcends that idea.
yeah.
And it's not just it isn't just because of his political perspective. I think it's also his professional
Yeah, yeah, no,
background.
absolutely. Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, 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 yeah. Yeah, and I would say like Asimov, I mean, he does have the sort of like Carrie Sheldon as a genius, but I think a lot of the works are working out of like what would the long term, collaborative project like the foundation entail.
Hmm.
It is a different way of thinking about science, and yeah, I do think that there is a kind of like right wing view of science as the lone inventor, which actually like on the one hand is very retrograde and but had a kind of resurgence thanks in part to Silicon Valley, where you did kind of have this period where like these are early people were like Bill Gates or Steve Jobs, like did kind of like
Although, frankly, neither one of those guys invented much of anything.
no, they didn't invent it. But there was like there's a kind of like the cultural
Well, okay,
mythology,
yeah.
and
There
Elon
you go.
Musk as
Yeah, I
well. I
agree
mean,
with
like I
you
think
there.
Elon
Yeah.
Musk, they're all kind of like feeding into this idea that there is, even though they're working with like vast teams, and they're kind of like they are kind of like a Thomas Edison figure reinvented for the modern age. Like there's a way in which the sort of narratives that were created for these figures and the way that they became the figurehead of companies allowed a kind of resurgence of like a very retrograde and like I think what we could agree is a false view of how science works.
Yeah, it is. And well, and I would say that this is yet another example that the scientific community, broadly speaking, globally and also in the US and in every country, generally seems to have exhibit what some people sometimes call the scientist fallacy, which is everyone else is a scientist. Everyone else respects science. Everyone else understands the scientific method and wants to use it in their own lives. And that is not true. And if
Yeah.
I may import my own H.G. Wells metaphor, that the society of science has become the Eloi, and they've let this revanchist, extremist, reactionary Morlock group exist without them, and now they're coming for them, and Donald Trump is going after NIH and tearing down these vaccine access and all of these things. And RFK Jr. is telling people to load up on fats and steak,
Yeah. Oh,
and they didn't, and so like basically they didn't educate the public about
yeah.
why this is good.
Yeah.
People liked what the products of science, but they didn't know how they were made and
Mhm.
why this is the only way that they can be made. That the scientific method is the ultimate invention.
Yeah. No, I think that's true. And maybe like another way to think about this is that there was always a kind of disjunction between the scientific world, the Republic of Science, which is this kind of like incredibly collaborative, internationalist, debate.
Humane,
Yeah.
open to all identities.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with a sort of political economy that was based on a different set of values, and where the people who would be running the science, running the corporations, had like a different set of agendas, and where like even in the corporate world, like you can see there's certain forms of corporatism that are actually like kind of similar to science in the sense of being like involving large scale enterprises, and but within like capitalism, you had uneven development, and you had people who were basically like Donald Trump, these kind of like old school predatory robber baron types, and as long as that model existed, they were the sort of Morlocks who could exist to prey on the Republic of Science.
Yeah, and I can say that myself as a former Republican Morlock.
Yeah.
So I'm not dehumanizing anybody. I'm just talking about my former self.
Yeah. But I think that like a key component of this is this distinction in political economy between this world of science that was created and political economic system that didn't quite fully align with it. And yeah,
Yeah,
that's causing a lot of problem. I mean, like it's like
it
really
is.
uncertain now, where like whether this kind of predatory capitalism is compatible with like the kind of scientific research that we've seen, or whether
Yeah,
science will become just a tool or servant or handmaiden. Um,
yeah,
uh,
absolutely.
yeah.
Well, and there's another unfortunate kind of layer to this, though, which is regarding current artificial intelligence research. So, the reality is, yes, these things are not. They don't have, minds. They're not minds in the same way that we are. But the latest models, they are really fucking good.
Mhm.
And if you think that these are just junk, like what you might have experienced in 2023 or something like that, that's not the reality. Like they are very good now at appropriate tasks. So like they're not going to help you report a news story, or like they can't do that.
Mhm.
There's a lot of things that they can't do, but when it comes to writing programming code, they're good at it. Like I
Yeah, sure.
personally
Yeah,
have
no,
tested
no,
it.
no, yeah,
I
yeah,
know
yeah,
it works. It
yeah,
works.
yeah, yeah.
Like
No, no,
and like it works for like a lot of scenarios. And so it's not, these things are not conscious, but
Mhm.
they're really fucking good. And like that to me should be an opportunity for the broader left to say, look, here is why we need basic income. Here is why we need right to housing. Here is why we need right to jobs, or whatever. Like if you've never had in the post USSR world, or let's say, the post kind of robber baron world that you were just talking about, we haven't ever had a better argument for this is why government is good and why we need it. And so we better work toward it, because this will help you, whoever you are.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I know. I mean, like, I'm not a AI skeptic in the sense that I don't think like it can do things. I don't actually think it's ever gonna. I don't think we're anywhere near consciousness. I mean,
Oh,
I
I've written a whole essay on why it's not. So I
yeah,
agree with
yeah,
you
and,
there.
I mean, I would even go further. I actually don't see, based on what they're doing, that this is the path for creating machine consciousness. But I mean, it is a path
Yeah,
for creating machines that are incredible servants who can do things, and then it becomes a question like, who's the master? Is it the broader democratic society, which is like my ideal, or is it going to be, a few plutocrats? Where that's going to be a very dangerous thing, because you're putting an immense amount of power in a very few hands.
yeah,
And that has always been the kind of, I mean, I think that has been the great debate since the Enlightenment, since humanity came to this realization that humans are not just subjects of history, but makers of history, and can, take control of our collective destiny. Then it becomes a question of, well, which humans, which is actually, speaks to the power of science fiction. I mean, I think this is one reason why this genre has, flourished in the last 200 years. I mean, it is the form of literature that most clearly addresses this question. Sometimes, as we've discussed, giving bad answers, but certainly putting forward, I think the right question.
yeah. Absolutely. So yeah, I mean, I would like to see better left-wing content about AI in the future. But putting that aside, like just to go back to Heinlein, like, so as we've been saying, touching on briefly earlier, he was somebody who started off as a socialist,
Mm-hmm.
and then over his
Yeah, yeah,
lifetime
yeah. No,
became more. Oh wait! Oh, I got to give a plug for your article,
oh,
though,
sure, sure,
Jeet.
yeah.
But yeah. So for those who do want to explore this further, Jeet wrote a really great piece in the New Republic. It was 2014 that it was a review of a biography of Heinlein. So it's definitely worth reading if you want to delve into this topic a bit more. But okay, all right. I gave you your plug there, Jeet.
Yeah, no, but thank you, thank you. No, I'll just like briefly run through, because I think Heinlein's own biography touches on so many of the things that we talked about in very
Yeah.
interesting ways. Because he's like born in 1907, like this kind of very interesting, this sort of like progressive family who had been abolitionist, like in like I believe they were like Missouri, Kansas, so I think they were like among the original sort of settlers
Kansas.
that came in to like make this a free state. And he was a big reader of science fiction, big reader of Wells, gets into the Navy, gets a TB, but then has this like amazing naval pension because he'd been an officer. So, which allows him, during the Great Depression to get an education, try his hand at, he did a bunch of different things. Like he tried to be a real estate agent, tried to be a silver miner, ran for political office, and then finally became a writer. But he's able to do this because he had UBI. He had UBI in the
He had a
form
free
of,
lunch.
he had a free lunch. He got a great free lunch. And he acknowledged it at the time. Like he had, in letters, he'd say, I've benefited from the taxpayers of America. But a free, a really a sexual revolutionary. I think his first wife, there's a story in the biography where she basically, slept with another man during their honeymoon, and then later, he would marry this woman, Lazane, and would she was also into free love, and often he and his buddies would be sharing partners, wife swapping or whatever, including with L. Ron Hubbard. L. Ron Hubbard, in a kind of interview, said, Heinlein basically forced me to sleep with his wife. But during this period in the 30s, 40s, like a Wellesian science fiction writer, and the utopian science fiction that he wrote, one which was only published posthumously, For Us the Living, and one called Beyond This Horizon, are fictions about UBI. They're this sort of utopian fiction where somebody wakes up into the future and it's like, well, wealth is socially created. And one of the novels, one of the characters says, he says, where do I pay? He goes in, he's from the present, wakes up into the future, says, where do I pay for food? And says, why would you pay for food? Like, what sort of barbaric society would make someone pay for like a necessity like this? Of course, we all like all the food is free. But also with the dark side of that fiction, like he was always a kind of interested in eugenics, not I would say in a racist point of view, because he often would have characters of all different races. Except in one case, he did a kind of anti-Japanese novel during World War II, where the plot came from John W. Campbell gave him the plot, and Heinlein would later say that the racism of the book, yeah, he would blame it on Campbell. But Lindelof was a very enlightened figure. As I said, they had this open marriage. Then, falls in love with a much younger woman, who he then brings in as a menage a trois. But that doesn't. His second wife, Liz Lane, isn't happy, becomes alcoholic. They divorce, and then he marries the younger woman, Virginia, who is like a real a Republican free market conservative. But I don't think it's just necessarily the change of partners, but also in the 50s, the Cold War comes along. He's very, he thinks Eisenhower is too soft. And, he's upset that Eisenhower is trying to negotiate nuclear testing with the Russians, and really goes off the deep end. And I think the nature of his fiction changes as well. Like, I think a lot of the fiction of the 40s and 50s, there's a story called Solution Unsatisfactory, which is written in the early 40s, which is imagining atomic weapons before they arose. I'm basically saying we're going to have to live with these things, but there's no good solution. Like going through whereas I think after that right-wing turn, which I think really solidifies with the publication of Starship Troopers, this hardline militarist novel, he really becomes the sort of Heinlein that is the right wing figure, exploring ideas of militarism, total free market capitalism. Instead of saying food should be free, in one of his later novels, he talks about a famine, and this was written at the time of the famine in Ethiopia. He says, stupid people, they didn't grow enough food, right? So a total inversion, I think, of his politics towards a kind of very selfishness. With, I think, maybe there had always been a little bit of a strand of that, because I think in the biography it makes clear, from a very early age, he had this sort of philosophical attraction to the idea of Salafism. Is that how I'm saying that right?
Solipsism.
Yeah, it's solipsism. Yeah, solipsism. Yeah. This idea, he believed at age 7, he was thinking what if all of reality is a creation of my mind? And he would periodically write this in his fiction, in things like a story called They, where a character realizes everything is just imagined. A very interesting sort of story by All You Zombies, which is about actually transitioning or sex change, where a combination of time travel and sex change allows the main character to become his own mother and father. And so he's basically has created himself. And in the fiction, this Salafism, it really becomes increasingly tied in a sexual way towards ideas of incest and pedophilia, really. So there's a lot of fiction where in Time Enough for Love, the main character Lazarus Long lives basically forever. Most of the people in the universe are his children. He clones himself and has female clones that he has sex with. He has time travel, has sex with his mother, and a lot of the novels are basically about how the ultimate form of individualism or individual self-expression is is incest. Yeah, and pedophilic incest as well, which is all justified on a sort of basis of, well, this is just fiction. We're just trying out ideas or whatnot. But yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say about that, except it is in some ways rigorous. It is actually taking the idea of individualism, radical individualism, in Heinlein's universe, leads to this logical conclusion of sex only with those that are closest to you, and also it doesn't all matter because everything itself is just a creation of my mind. And
Uh,
then, yeah, obviously, I think it's morally reprehensible. And it does align with a lot of what we're seeing in the sort of Silicon Valley elite that we're happy to hang out with Jeffrey Epstein.
yeah.
But I think, and who himself also has, like Jeffrey Epstein, all this interest in eugenics. He wanted to basically create a sort of seed farm where he would have a huge number of children like Lazarus Long.
Yeah.
Uh,
Or
uh,
Elon Musk, actually.
or Elon Musk, yes, exactly. Like obviously sort of morally reprehensible. I will say with Heinlein, I do think there's a kind of interesting rigor. I actually do think he's rigorously working out the logic of radical individualism in a way that I think a lot of other people shy away from.
Yeah, although oddly, as much as he was talking about individual freedom, for most of his novels, as far as I can tell, some of them are explicitly homophobic, and
Yeah,
but he does have some amount of that. But yeah, he doesn't get to that point of working things out because presumably if you are having full liberation, you would have sex with whoever you wanted to,
yeah,
and
yeah.
that would include people of your own sex, if you were
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
maximally
Well, I mean, he had this
interested.
a really a classical sexist guy where he actually thought lesbianism was great. Bill homosexuality turned him off because I do actually think that there are sort of lesbian characters. And actually, I mean, interestingly, I mean, there's sort of all these sort of interesting contradictions. He was more open to transsexuals than he was to gay men. They are kind of sympathetically portrayed sex change in his fiction, and I think that he actually had a close friend who had a sex change operation, and this person has written about how supportive Heinlein was. So some very interesting sort of contradictions in his work.
Yeah, and one of the other, probably, I guess, arguably his most famous work, which you have mentioned a bit, is his Stranger in a Strange Land
Mm.
book, which, does, I think, is really what kind of, at least in his public writings, that's kind of where, I mean, he was an example. So this book, I believe it was 1960 when it came out, if I remember
Yeah,
right.
yeah, early
Um,
'60s. Yeah, yeah,
yeah, and so it was in a lot of ways, it was a touchstone of the new left hippie movement.
Mhm.
And even though the guy that was writing it was not on the left, and that to me is one of the more other interesting things about him as an author, and other people in this milieu as well, like Robert Anton Wilson is another one.
Mm.
That
Yeah,
these were guys that they actually were right wing libertarians, but for a long time, people on the left didn't realize that these guys were right wing. And
yeah,
only
yeah, yeah.
now, during like QAnon and Trump and whatnot, only now are a lot of people on the left realizing, oh, these people are right wing. Even though the hippie, so much of hippie culture was always right wing. And you look
Yeah,
at Timothy Leary, and I mean, the guy was a straight up libertarian. The whole idea of dropping out of society, that was anarchism and going away and anti-government and
yeah.
anti-society, nihilism. That's what
Yeah,
this was.
antisocial and anti-communal. I mean, I think that's a.
Yeah,
I mean, if I were to sort of trace back, the most philosophically respectable part of this would be the sort of Emersonian, Thoreauvian, American
sure.
tradition. And I think even in Stranger in Strange Land, there's an idea in the novel we're all God. We all have this divinity in us, which I think is a sort of transcendental idea, and it is very appealing to traditions on the left of anti-authoritarianism, uh,
Yeah.
which in practice often do align with the right and also have this kind of mystical strain. So as I mentioned, L. Ron Hubbard created a religion, as did Robert Heinlein. I mean, in some ways, I do actually think Stranger in Strange Land, he was maybe doing, if not quite a satire, I think he was trying to think through what happened with his friend Hubbard and imagining what a new religion would be if people did have these telekinetic, these powers that Hubbard
Hmm.
claimed. But the irony is that, like, Stranger in a Strange Land also led to like new religions being created. I think there's actually, like, like these churches that came out in Southern California, which were inspired by that novel. And it's almost a sort of a paradox of science fiction that this, especially Campbellian science fiction, that wanted to be so rigorous and scientific that, like, like in its sort of decadence, early decadence, it immediately became mystical and cult-like in the case of Dianetics, right? Like, so
Yeah.
what became the promise of scientific rationality quickly succumbed to follow the cult leader.
Yeah, and do a lot of drugs.
Yeah, 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 yeah. No, no,
um,
no. I mean, yeah, yeah, yeah. This,
yeah. Well, okay. So just going back to kind of the sexual predation as a form of liberation, because that's really kind of what we're talking about, and that is kind of a pretty strong theme in a lot of these later Heinlein novels.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah, yeah. No,
um,
I mean, I do think that there's a kind of interesting. I think he was trying to work out what sexual liberation would mean, and once he's in his biography, that I think that he couldn't quite realize. I mean, this is really my great critique of the novels, which is not that there's a lot of sex in them, but that there's a lot of inconsequential sex. That you don't really get a sense of, like, a world where sexual activity, leads to heartbreak or to, like, emotional turmoil,
or
where,
violence.
like,
Yeah.
or especially in the case of like incest, like, like obvious trauma, like he is like a free lunch, like, what if we could have all the sex we wanted without any consequences? Well, yeah, that would be great, but you can only do that in the form of this novel, right? That is not actually the world that we live in.
Yeah.
Just as he wanted, like, let's have total free market capitalism, and like, but it all works out great.
With
Uh,
no consequence. Yeah.
yeah, without consequences. And how, let's have like total militarism, where we're destroying all these space bugs and nobody has like shell shock or PTSD and or is damaged. Like, like,
And
yeah.
there are no dissidents.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, 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 yeah. There's no, yeah, yeah. It is like, I mean, this is the sort of critique of the kind of like later novel. Like, at every stage, he's like imagining his ideal world without consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and yeah, and then going back to the Epstein angle here. So Heinlein is actually mentioned in the Epstein files.
Oh, is he? Oh, I didn't see that.
Yeah, and he. So there's an email that, not by Epstein though, I should say, but there's the German AI researcher named Joschka Bach, and he's writing to Epstein, and basically they're having these long conversations, essentially about fascism and how it might be good. Epstein and Bach are doing that, and so I'm going to just quote from Bach here, and when he says. I rather like the treatment that fascism gets in the Amazon series The Man in the High Castle, which explores what would have happened if the Germans and Japanese had won the war, a society that tries to function as a brutal and ruthlessly efficient machine, eliminating all social and evolutionary slack. It is very dark, but not a flat caricature of pointless evil for its own sake. Heinlein's late book, obviously not late book, but Heinlein's late book, Starship Troopers, explores fascism too. But unlike Philip K. Dick, he does not see it as a form of insanity, but as the most desirable order. And then he goes on to say, I find your political incorrectness very fascinating. So that's, I mean, like, that's what we're talking about here. Like, this is, so essentially, what you're saying, this idea of, kind of liberty as, there's always this tension of, well, who is liberty for? Is it for the individual, or is it for everyone in the society? And how, like, that's essentially what it comes down to. And Heinlein and this authoritarian capitalist Nietzschean, fascist, reactionary, whatever you want to call it, it basically has arrived at the idea that liberty, we must maximize liberty for some people who can have all degrees of freedom. And that is the best way for humanity to survive and become a multiplanetary species, as Elon Musk says.
Yeah, no. Maybe another way to think about this is the kind of the role of democracy in like all of this. And I mean, as I said, we're talking about classical liberalism. This is broad liberal tradition, and I think like democracy was a relative latecomer within the liberal tradition. Like there's actually
Yeah.
something that came out because of the labor and socialist movement of the 19th centuries were pushing for this, and then you had some people within the liberal tradition, like John Stuart Mill, who realized, okay, we're going to have democracy, then we're going to have to change our notions of liberty to include a more broader sense of general welfare. And in Mill's case, also including like women and like imagining what a liberty for all would be in a democratic society where everyone has some say in the polity. And I think that one way to define this authoritarian libertarianism is that it doesn't want to make that thing. And one sees this explicitly in Heinlein, where like in Time Enough for Love, he basically says, democracy doesn't make sense. Like, why is it that like if some 50 plus 1 percent of the people believe something is true, like that's the way we should go. Like there's no reason to have that, right? Well, if you reject the idea that there, like we have to have some sort of like system where like everybody's voice is part of it, and one has to attend to other people's voices and like make some sort of compromises. If you I think Heinlein and authoritarian libertarianism only works if one rejects the democratic imperative. If one says from the start, like it doesn't matter, what most people want. It's like what the elite want, and then the characters in Heinlein's fiction are this sort of glorified elite, like people who are, for whatever reason, genetics, intelligence, the superior beings. And he's very explicit about that. Like,
Yeah, he is. When another quote from To Sail Beyond the Sunset that I thought was notable of his political ideology. And of course, I suppose his diehard fans might say, well, he didn't say these things. His characters said these things. And it's like, well,
yeah, but I'm saying, like, I've read a fair bit of his nonfiction, including a lot of his letters have been published now.
And it's very, very
it's exactly as one would predict from reading these novels, because it's his hectoring voice that is all univocal. Like, one would have assumed that this is what Heinlein believes, and in the letters, he's basically saying all the exact same things. But continue.
Yeah. So I'm going to quote from it. So he says, "In To Sail Beyond the Sunset," which is literally an ode to incest, basically, this novel. He says, "Democracy often works beautifully at first, but once the state extends the franchise to every warm body, be he producer or parasite, that day marks the beginning of the end of the state. For when the plebs discover that they can vote themselves bread in circuses without limit, and that the productive members of the body politic cannot stop them, they will do so until the state bleeds to death, or in its weakened condition, the state succumbs to an invader. The barbarians enter Rome," which the invasion metaphor, like that's the most constant metaphor that you see Donald Trump making. I do think that that's why Trump is so appealing to these same people, because even though they know that he's stupid and incompetent and corrupt, like they know all of that. Anyone can see that who's not willfully blinded. They know this about him, but they admire that about him, actually, because he just does what he wants. And in that sense, Donald Trump is the Nietzschean Antichrist Ubermensch, because as he said in the Antichrist, he explicitly said, "I'm not against Christianity per se, and I don't dislike Jesus. I'm against this culture that you guys have built up of restraining the Ubermensch." So Trump, in a way, is this Antichrist Ubermensch, and that's why they like
it. Which I think itself is the best refutation of
why it doesn't work.
No. I think that's right. Yeah.
And so essentially, like that's kind of what I think is the message that we're getting out of these Epstein files. So like the more stuff that comes out that people are reading, they're like, Jeffrey Epstein had this mentality. He was a right-wing libertarian by the end of his life. Whatever he was earlier, this guy was a libertarian capitalist oligarch, and that's what he was trying to build. And we see
Yeah,
that.
no, I think that's right. I think I mean it's interesting to think about the evolution because Epstein I do think of him as a fairly normal globalist neoliberal in the sort of like 90s and even 2000s. But I think that once that I think a lot of these figures, if they meet any sort of challenge, and in Epstein's case, it was like a criminal case. But I think the global financial meltdown, a lot of these people like then felt much more beleaguered, felt like they had to like retrench for a much more hardline politics, and then they did retreat away from any commitment towards the public good, towards a politics of pure sort of selfishness of the Ubermensch. So yeah, I mean, I think that's almost like in some ways, they're liberal when times are good, and then become libertarians, when times go bad. I think that's the kind of
Yeah.
logic of it. Yeah.
Yeah, and then Epstein also, like the world that he was building for himself with these trafficked girls and women, like this is the maximal individual liberty vision that these right-wing sci-fi authors were talking about. This is the total sexual liberation that Heinlein was, this is the actual version of what it looks like.
No, absolutely.
Instead
Absolutely.
of the fantasy.
Yeah. No, I mean, I know. I think that's right. Yeah. I mean, another way to think about this all is in terms of like sort of the genre of science fiction. Yeah, I think that science fiction is the kind of like the dream life or the research and development project of both the national security state and the sort of Silicon Valley sort of plutocracy. Like I think a lot of people like Musk and Peter Thiel, read a lot of this fiction and then basically used it as a kind of like how-to. And Heinlein himself, I mean, because of his tuberculosis, he was not able to serve in the military, but he did like sort of research stuff for the Navy during World War II, and he basically came up with a prototype for this spacesuit. But more broadly, a lot of his ideas, were taken up by sort of the Rand Corporation and other outfit. So, I mean, I think one way to see the function of the genre is that it's a place where, like, sort of the early ideas for this cohort, this sort of, I think, almost Southern California combination of military-industrial surveillance state technocrats and libertarians, which is a contradictory position, but I think like it's socially like they've always been worked together and fused together, and that's why the author of Starship Trooper is also the author of Stranger in a Strange Land.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this has been a great discussion, but if we can, maybe end it with, let's turn to better sci-fi authors than these guys, because as you said, there's, and I do want to give a plug for my friend Ada Palmer, who is a historian and also a sci-fi writer. So
yes, I know her work. Yeah.
So she explores a lot of these same themes, but in a much more humane way. But there's a lot of other authors, so I'm interested to hear who you might recommend in that regard for people.
Oh, okay. I mean, I think an interesting sort of counterpart is Ursula K. Le Guin, who is coming out of sort of anarchism, but kind of like a left anarchism, and in like the left hand of darkness and Dispossessed, explored in a very sophisticated way, like ideas of sort of gender equality and the trade-offs that might exist in an anarchic society where things are poorer, but you have like greater sort of social satisfaction. So I think Le Guin in general is like a great example. Joanna Russ, I think, explored many of these same ideas. So yeah, I mean, I think there's I think maybe the more dystopian science fiction writers are the dystopian tradition, obviously, like Orwell and Huxley, but carried forward by someone like Octavia Butler, is exploring the dark side of this, and one sees that also in like Philip K. Dick and J.G. Ballard. who are interested in all the same things as Heinlein was, but maybe are like much more attentive to the social psychological consequences of this kind of future.
Yeah. Okay, great. Well, those are some starter recommendations for anybody who hasn't already gone for those authors yet. So you got any things upcoming you might want to plug for the audience to check?
Well, yeah, no, I mean, I just generally, write for the Nation magazine and have, and do the Time of Monsters podcast. So if anyone wants to hear more from me, you can go to the Nation magazine and there'll be a lot of content there.
Okay, sounds good. Thanks for being here.
Oh, thanks. It was a great conversation.
All right, so that is the program for today. I appreciate you joining us for the conversation. And you can always get more if you go to theoryofchange.show, where we have the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And if you're a paid subscribing member, you have unlimited access to the archives. And I thank you very much for your support. That does mean a lot. It's a bad economy for media right now. So anybody who can support the show financially, that means a lot. And it's only a small amount of money per month, less than a cup of coffee, where you might be buying them at Starbucks or whatever. So if you can support the show financially, that would be great. I appreciate it. And if you're watching on YouTube, please do click the like and subscribe button so you can get notified whenever there's a new episode. Thanks a lot. I'll see you next time.